Hey, so colleagues, we're back. It's May the 12th, and we've dealt with our council agenda, and we're now looking at a budget committee, standing committee of the whole on budget. Normally, this would be chaired by the chairman of Audit Finance, Russell Walker, Councillor Walker. I'm doing it here because we have access to technological support. So we're going to continue, and just in terms of setting the stage, which Jacques may do in any event, we were going to pass our budget. All the work was done on our budget for August, or for March 24th or 26th, and then COVID-19 hit. So there've been impacts on the budget, and so we're having a look at it now, and you have some information that's been sent out to you. So staff have done a lot of work on this. It's now time for us to do the same. So I'm going to ask Jacques and Jane. I think, Jacques, you're going to take us away on a presentation on the budget.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. You can all hear me?
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and members of Regional Council. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and staff who are watching or listening through other means. So for the past couple of months, HRM has been responding to the rapidly evolving effects of COVID-19. This has been an incredibly challenging time for our residents, our businesses, and of course the HRM team, comprised of the mayor, council, and of course all of our staff and union leadership. So it's been a very tough time. I don't think any of us have experienced this. Likely none of us were around in the Great Depression, perhaps Bill Carson, but other than that, I think we're probably a first for everyone. We're not alone in the battle against the virus or its economic impact. Every municipality, province, state, and country is adapting to the situation and taking the necessary steps to move forward in search of a new normal. I know the mayor, myself, and other members of the team are part of pan-Canadian or pan-North American meetings where, for example, in my case, I meet with city managers across North America, United States, and Canada every couple of weeks over using technology to figure out what they're doing, what we can learn, what they learn from us, and those kinds of things. So, I can tell you every province and state and country is facing the same kinds of challenges, and we're learning from each other and supporting from each other. As everyone's aware, the municipality has reduced some services for March, April, and May, and we will continue to operate at a reduced capacity for the foreseeable future. We have also extended the tax bill due date to residents and businesses to help provide some relief during this stressful time. Of course, the municipality takes its role of financial stewardship very seriously and understands the significant responsibility of safeguarding our residents' tax dollars. Municipal staff with the leadership of mayor and regional council are faced with the task of striking a balance between stimulating the economy on the one hand and being fiscally responsible on the other. Our plan must also remain nimble to the ever-changing situation, and I want to be very clear that we will continue to monitor and adjust our plan and our service levels as necessary to meet the best needs, or meet the needs, I should say, of our residents and local businesses. So, for example, we know certain adjustments to physical workspaces and infrastructure will be needed in order for staff to safely serve our residents. Items such as sneeze guards in our service counters and buses, to the extent feasible, are just one of the many things that we need to consider while COVID-19 is still present in our communities. And as the need for social distancing will remain in place for the foreseeable future, certainly well into next year, based on information that we've been provided and found, we're also looking closely at required adaptations to the use of our streets, sidewalks, and bike lanes, as we discussed this morning. Our staff are actively engaged in planning for measures that can be deployed quickly, while also considering what will be needed over the coming months in response to public health directives as we progress into the recovery phases. Of course, we'll also be sharing more information about the municipality's transportation recovery plan as it unfolds. So the financial challenges have required many difficult decisions. Before Easter, we reduced staffing levels by more than 1,400 people. Senior management has taken every effort to ensure that there are not widespread layoffs of permanent staff. However, as our services change and adapt, staffing levels may be adjusted accordingly. We are also continuing with our capital budget program. From the beginning of the pandemic, HRM has been clear that it is important to keep the economy going. We have been doing that and doing our part through ensuring that vendors are paid and capital work continues where it can. And I want to thank all of our business units involved in capital projects for the outstanding work you've done to date, and some incredible extra effort in order to move these projects forward. And while there are some projects that will unfortunately be delayed, we have not lost sight of our long-term goal of continuing to grow the municipality and making it an exceptional place to live and to do business. Mr. Mayor, what we are seeing and experiencing socially and economically will result in a fundamental change to the way we live, work, share experiences in HRM. There will be a new normal, but it will take time, patience, and resilience to achieve it. In relation to our budget outline, the municipality is facing pandemic response costs and significant revenue losses from no longer collecting fees for transit, recreation programming, parking, and rental losses, and other sources of revenue. By legislation, municipalities cannot run deficits, and substantial losses cannot be easily recovered from reserves or borrowing. At the federal and provincial levels, they can actually debt finance these extraordinary costs for generations. We cannot do that. So right now we are currently evaluating how we will use the $300 million or $380 million provincial loan program aimed to help municipalities with cash flow by providing access to funds at a favorable interest rate. And thanks so much to the province for this important measure. More support from the province and the federal government will be needed, particularly in relation to cost-sharing infrastructure and targeted support for businesses that HRM is not permitted to do. The mayor and I are also working with the province and the federal government regarding the need for cost-sharing shovel-ready infrastructure projects to help keep the economy going. And the municipality is still issuing tenders and contracts when appropriate to keep our economy as well as our municipal priorities moving forward. We have just over $200 million in capital spending planned for this year, subject to council's approval, notwithstanding the pandemic. So before I move on to the presentation, I just want to say that we know recovery to the new normal will take time. The recommendations being presented to council as part of this recast budget is a strong attempt by staff to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and allow us to start the recovery process. I want to thank all of our staff who have worked tirelessly, many long days, over weekends to bring forward this revised budget. It has not been an easy task, and your continued dedication and professionalism is appreciated by all, and most particularly by me as CAO. I also want to thank you, Mr. Mayor Savage, and members of Regional Council, as well as our directors, our union leaders, and all staff for your continued dedication to safely provide public services upon which our residents and businesses depend. So on that, Mr. Mayor, I would like to proceed with the budget presentation. With your indulgence.
Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as I said in my opening remarks, we're here to begin Budget Committee deliberations on the recast 2021 operating and capital budgets. We have directors and some key managers logged on through Microsoft Teams to assist answering any questions that you may have. The proposed format for the day is to go through the presentation and answer your questions on the details. We will not get through everything today. We are scheduled to reconvene tomorrow afternoon at 1:30, and we will pick up where we left off if that is acceptable to Budget Committee. We also have a meeting scheduled next week, and we may require others to achieve an approved budget by the end of May, which is really our objective here. I would like to remind everyone that the starting point for this budget is the budget that would have been voted on March 24th. That budget including all the approved parking lot items, budget adjustment list, and had a 1.4% average tax bill increase. And with that, I will begin. So go to slide 1, please. So this is what I'll be presenting. A lot of the information is covered in the staff report. So I will be speaking at a high level about the various topics. Beginning with economic impacts. We go to slide 3. This is a slide that was presented to you as part of the fiscal framework presentation. We always talk about the economy, and often it is difficult to see how the economy either up or down impacts HRM and our revenue and expenses. But the economy affects substantially HRM in 3 ways: GDP, retail sales, income, support our growth over medium term and impact quality of life. As expected, population changes, dwelling units, and inflation all impact service costs. Inflation increases unit prices and salary pressure. Population dwellings bring both new costs and new revenues. New construction and leases also impact our revenue. Our tax system is primarily based on bricks and mortar. It often takes time for the tax revenue impact to catch up with the buildings. Next slide. In relation to economic impact, the economic outlook for HRM at April 28th. Is what this slide shows, and the extent of how deep the economic impact is at this time is largely unknown and is directly related to the easing of public health measures. We saw last Friday, Stats Canada released the national unemployment numbers for the month of April. 2 million jobs were lost in April alone. In Nova Scotia, the unemployment rate for April is 12%, with 50,000 jobs lost, mainly in the hospitality and service industry and mainly within HRM. To give you a sense of the change, in January, when the fiscal framework was presented, our predictions for HRM were real GDP growth of 1.8%, personal income to grow by 2.7%, and inflation at 2.2%. And we were very confident we would either achieve or outpace those numbers or overshoot those numbers. Now, with the COVID-19 impacts on the economy, we expect GDP to fall by 5.9%. Employment falling by 7.7%, and labor income falling by 6.2%. Economists refer to this as negative supply shock, meaning production is severely impaired, I should say, across all sectors. This also has a demand destruction component, which means a permanent move down the demand curve towards reduced demand induced by a prolonged period of high prices or constrained supply. I think it's pretty clear if you go into some of the grocery stores these days, there's constrained supply. And many manufacturers are not producing right now. The 6.18% fall refers to the fall in the labor income from 2020 to 2021, 11,990 to 11,249. And I know that doesn't follow the rates of change for the other indicators in the chart, but the labor income measure is new for this outlook, and there isn't any data on this for 2018 and HRM as in the other indicators. So there's also a time lag in the data, and that is why it is 2018 versus 2019 in relation to that metric. In the new outlook, labor income is a total aggregate labor income in the economy. It is not personal disposable income, if that's a question you may have, as in our original economic forecast. And the reason for that Statistics Canada data is not available for personal disposable income on a monthly basis to predict. So instead, our consultants, Canac Economics, use total labor income as a proxy to show an order of magnitude how income is falling in the economy. And we don't have a better estimate on personal disposable income until there are a few more months of data coming in. So pre-COVID-19, long-term growth prospects were already on shaky ground in most advanced countries. This shock has exacerbated that. According to the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford, this shock is as severe as the Great Depression in terms of labor market losses. Long-term impacts on labor force and demand for labor may be grave. Halifax is somewhat insulated due to the composition of the service sector. Health, education, civil service, military, professional services are tied to these. Slide 5, please. This is the graphic representation of the impact of COVID-19 on HRM. This infographic was created by HRM staff, so I do not want anyone to think that it was created by public health or the provincial government. It is simply the potential impacts on HRM as a whole. Some of them we have experienced already. The next 3 slides break out the impacts by public health, social, and economic, and finally, longer-term shifts so that it's easier to see and understand. Slide 6. With public health issuing a state of emergency in March, we saw a lockdown and cancellation of many services and programs. Council took a number of steps, such as foregoing transit fares and providing free parking at our parking meters. We also shifted to working from home where possible, and we have adopted new processes such as paying for permits online, and we modified our service delivery. And I can tell you that we have over 2,600 HRM team members working from home at the moment, and I'm so proud of them and the productivity that they're actually delivering on. So thank you. Parks opening 2 weeks ago saw a gradual loosening of restrictions based on provincial updates from the Premier. It is safe to say it will be a while before more restrictions are lifted. It will be a very gradual reopening, as we discussed earlier today. Moving forward is the need to understand how to engage the public in consultations and how we celebrate civic events such as Canada Day. Dr. Strang has been very clear. The likelihood of large gatherings occurring this year is slim to none. Slide 7. On the social and economic front, over the next year or two, HRM will continue to experience financial pressure. Those residents, and particularly businesses that have been hard hit by COVID-19, will continue to struggle to pay their tax bills. If you think of the hospitality sector, bars and restaurants that already operate on razor-thin margins, their ability to survive will be a challenge. It will become even more difficult when you overlay the public's fear of going out and resuming pre-COVID activities as they did before. HRM's commercial tax base will see little growth and quite possibly contraction over the next couple of years. Combined with reduced ability to pay and increased assessment appeals, tax revenues will be constrained. As challenging as this budget is, the hard work does not end there. The next 2 years will require continued financial focus, and while HRM adjusts to new ways to deliver its services, we are very confident that the 21-22 budget will be even more challenging. Slide 8. This phase is labeled long-term, and I think it's more about societal change. We will not be going back to pre-COVID way of life. What we are seeing and experiencing will result in fundamental change to the way we live, we work, and share experiences in this municipality. What we've gone through will change the way our residents interact with us and will change their expectations of our services coming out of this. Of specific concern is the ability to engage with the public and ensure all residents in HRM have a voice. And not everyone in HRM has access to online service, and cell coverage in some areas is still very spotty. Mr. Mayor, at this point, we have some hints of potential lasting changes, but if the last 8 weeks have taught us anything, there will be much more for us to learn in the coming days, weeks, and months to come. Now, the next section will speak to financial impact. And slide 10 is, I'm going to speak to municipalities across Canada to a certain level. So, moving on to the financial impacts of COVID-19, which is really twofold, one being a liquidity issue, and i.e. cash, and the other is a revenue loss issue. So liquidity, and the other is revenue loss. And HRM is certainly not alone in facing these challenges. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities, led by its inimitable President, Councillor Bill Carson, issued a discussion paper that was attached to the staff report. And in it, they estimate the cost of COVID-19 nationally for 6 months is in the range of $10 to $15 billion. And for those municipalities with public transit system, the transit losses are $400 million a month. Of course, we know that our transit losses are $3 million a month. Slide 11. As I said at the beginning, the starting point for the recast budget was the budget that would have been voted on March 24th. The operating budget was $1 billion, $832.4 million of municipal expenditures, and $168.2 million in mandatory provincial costs. It included a solid capital plan and stable debt levels with relatively healthy reserves. We were on a solid financial footing until COVID-19 hit. And with that came an immediate loss of revenue. That has a budget impact this year, and depending on how quickly the revenue rebounds, such as transit fares, could well impact next year, and almost certainly so. The impact to businesses and residents in some sectors is steep. Even with government assistance, a number of businesses and residents will not be able to pay their taxes, which is a cash flow issue for us. Next slide. The budget of the municipality is designed to achieve council's strategic priorities. In November, Regional Council went through a strategic priorities outcomes exercise where they approved business unit initiatives that support council's priorities. With a sudden and deep impact of COVID-19, a number of those initiatives will be delayed in implementation. It is anticipated that staff will bring forward a revised strategic priorities plan after the 2021 budget is passed. The strategic plan will outline the changing initiatives for council's and the public's direction and the public's information. We could talk about the cash flow challenge now, cash flow versus revenues. So on slide 14, as you've heard me and our awesome CFO, Jane Fraser, say over the last few weeks, we are facing two significant challenges. First is the revenue shortfall. This is money that we will never recover. It is lost deed transfer taxes, transit revenue, recreation program, etc. Revenue losses are recovered through budget reductions and/or tax increases. Cash flow is a timing issue. You will likely get the money, you just don't know when. The impact of people not being able to pay their taxes falls under that category. We have looked at the commercial assessment role by type of business and did an analysis of those businesses who they thought would not be able to pay their taxes. The impact on commercial and apartments was $98 million. On the residential side, it was assumed that 25% of households will not be able to pay their residential property tax. And that represented $90 million. So that is where the number of 188 million comes from. This number is an estimate and is based on the best information that we have at this time. Staff have since analyzed the payments we received up to April 30th. These are the tax payments, property tax payments from businesses and residents, which was the original tax bill due date on April 30th. And it looks like as if our numbers that we predicted of the $188 million are actually holding. So we will be coming back to Regional Council for approval for short-term borrowing to offset the cash flow issue in the next few weeks. And what I'm talking about there is the short-term loan program, thankfully established by the province. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about tax revenues. From an accounting perspective, we earn tax revenue when it is billed. It doesn't matter if we receive the cash or not. When we actually get the cash in the bank, when we actually get the cash in the bank is what impacts cash flow. Cash comes in and we pay our bills and it flows out. So if we do not have enough cash coming in and no money in the bank, we can't pay our bills. Thank you so much, Corey. It's pretty simple. Cash in, cash out. Tax revenue, on the other hand, is based on accounting rules. And as Jane knows well, I'm not an accountant. But as I said, we report on it as if we are going to get it, except for a valuation allowance for taxes that we will never be paid or assessed, or there will be assessment appeals. Reality is that year end, the fiscal 2021 financial statements could be showing a large surplus, but we have no money in the bank. We are asset rich, but cash poor. And Jane's analogy is what we have a $10 million house and we are burning the woodwork for heat because we have no cash. That's the situation we could find ourselves in. I'd like to talk now on slide 17 about the provincial short-term loan. As many of you know, the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities and the Association of Municipal Administrators of Nova Scotia have been working with the province to come up with a tax deferral program. But unfortunately, the deferral program, as hoped, was not able to be achieved due to a lack of legislative authority. So the province has established a short-term borrowing program for municipalities. They have made that $380 million available to assist municipalities with cash flow, for which we are very thankful. The terms of the loan are a 3-year repayment at an interest rate of 1.1%, and municipalities will be asked to justify the amount of the loan. In other words, illustrate that it's related to non-payment of taxes due to COVID-19. Staff will be seeking separate council approval to borrow a maximum of $188 million. The number will be refined once the June tax bills are paid and we have an understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on taxpayers' ability to pay at that point. Needless to say, we have another billing in October, and it's difficult to predict what will happen then. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we use our cash, how we use our short-term lending, and how we use our reserves. On slide 18, I'll speak to reserves. In order to remain liquid, staff will be looking at options to use reserves as well as the short-term operating loan from the Municipal Finance Corporation. There are a number of reserves that we are required to have, and ones that ones that if we do borrow from them, we must pay the money back with interest. So staff are preparing a report to allow the CFO and the CAO to recommend withdrawals and reserves outside of the permitted use of the reserve. And this authority, should council grant it, would be for fiscal 2021 only and would still require regional council's approval. We have circulated to you a worksheet of reserve balances so you can see the proposed inflows and outflows. And you may recall my memo last night to you on that front. So if you have any questions, we'll certainly be here to answer those as we finish up. But some reserves have commitments against them for future uses. And of course, that can always be changed by council. We are also projecting to use almost $29 million from reserves to fund our revised capital budget. And this does not include the gas tax reserve, which is at $46 million. So we're effectively going to be drawing down $75 million out of reserves to fund our capital budget. There have been many questions asked about why we just don't take the money from reserves now to close the budget gap. If we had certainty that this cash flow issue and revenue shortfall would be over by October, that may well be a viable approach. The reality is no one knows how deep this is. In October, based on how tax payments come in, we may need to borrow cash from the reserves to remain liquid. We may also need to borrow from the reserves for fiscal 21-22 budget to close that budget gap. As I mentioned earlier, 21-22 will be worse, folks. The challenge we face next year will be much tougher. We spend all the cash in reserves now, we will be faced with having we could be faced with having to increase taxes significantly and incur more debt, but it has to be paid back, leading to decreased costs. And frankly, if we borrow too much money from the province on short term, that has a compounding effect. So, you'll see in the operating budget that we're proposing to pay back about $30 million in short-term financing this year. If you borrow another $100 million in the fall and another $100 million next year, all of a sudden those payments go up substantially, and there's little room fiscally to pay for that without increasing taxes. Not something that anybody wants to do. Slide 19. The budget challenge we are facing is much longer than just fiscal 2021. Because it's a multi-year impact. Some of the challenges we are facing is that recommendations are being made without a lot of information and is based on assumptions, and those assumptions can change on the next economic impact release. In fact, we're looking. I think our position was in one place in March. It was another place in April, and it's another place in May, and likely by next month we'll have a different or changing advice for you again. So we have to be very careful as what decisions we make today, and ensure that we set aside capacity to meet our requirements. So often when municipal budgets are delivered, people look at them and assess them on the individual items that are in the budget. If it contains funding for things that they care about, it's a good budget. This budget is different. This budget is based on making us stable and liquid and positioning us to come out of the COVID recession with resiliency, and we definitely need resiliency going forward. This budget is not a collection of items that add up to either a good budget or a bad budget, I would argue, but it's rather a defensive and resilient budget looking towards the medium to long term. Next slide. This is a refresh of the tax rate recommendation in March. 1.4% increase in the average residential tax bill, or an average increase of $27 per household. The tax rate was not recommended to increase. On the commercial side, next slide, the average commercial tax bill was also projected to increase by 1.4%, with an average increase of $585 on the tax bill. The commercial tax rate actually increased by 0.4%. And this is because of the soft commercial assessment growth. And I do want to point out at this time, we are not recommending a tax change for either residential or commercial within this restated budget. Next slide. These are some of the impacts that we have seen already. Regional Council has shifted the tax bill due date from April 30th to June 1st, lowered the interest rate charged on tax arrears, lost revenue from fares and programming, increased cleaning costs to ensure staff and the public are safe. We are seeing some reduced costs due to not providing programming or occupying buildings. Next slide. In the longer term, we expect to see the commercial tax base will see little growth or possibly declines over the next 2 years. Unfortunately, some businesses will not come back. In fact, most economists across North America are predicting that 30% of the existing small and medium-sized businesses will not reopen. More businesses and residents will not be able to pay their tax bills. People may get through the June bill, possibly through the October 31st bill, and depending on how deep or long the economic downturn is, will have impacts to tax revenue beyond 2021. Whatever the extent, it's clear that the tax revenue impacts will continue beyond 2021. We do not expect transit ridership to reach pre-COVID levels this year or even next year, which will result in a continued decrease in transit revenue. We will have to budget to pay back the short-term operating loan that I spoke to earlier, and we could be left with severely depleted reserves. Next slide. The revenue gap that we have to close through budget reductions or tax increases is $44 million. We are estimating a 55% decrease in transit revenue, or $20 million of the 44. A 15% decrease in deed-transfer tax from $51 million to $43.35 million. And interest revenue is cut in half, and then another $12 million in fees and other revenue losses. The one positive piece in this is building permit revenue continues to increase. Kelly Denty and her team in planning development are still receiving many applications and processing them in very quick order. Next slide. Our budget gap is estimated to be approximately $85 million. I have said a number of times that in this environment, it's very difficult to know what the full impact will be. I would say that the budget before you today is neither wildly pessimistic or wildly optimistic. Staff have restructured the budget to give the municipality flexibility. If the recovery is quicker than anticipated, we can add items back in. If it is deeper, then accessing the short-term operating loan and keeping some money in reserves, we can use those funds to offset any shortfalls. In addition to revenue loss, we are budgeting to pay back 6 months principal and interest payments for the short-term loan this year. And as part of generally accepted accounting principles in the province's financial reporting accounting manual, a valuation allowance is being set at $10 million. This is for tax revenue that will never be collected. This number is based on professional judgment and should reflect current economic and business conditions. Next slide. Before I go into budget mitigations, I want to thank the directors and the senior leadership team and their respective staff for all of their hard work. Budget targets were very tough, and they have worked very hard to deliver reductions that still allow HRM to deliver on its core services, advance council's priorities, and provide some resiliency going forward over the next couple of years. While senior management has not directed HRM-wide layoffs to achieve budget targets, layoffs may be felt in some business units due to service changes. Next slide. Compensation reductions include already announced layoffs and the hiring freeze and an increase in vacancy management across the organization. Direction for organization-wide layoffs of permanent staff was not given as part of this budget exercise. Gas and diesel has been reduced by 28% for price decreases, and we expect volume decreases as well. I think my car has only consumed about $10 worth of gas in the last 2 months. So that's an indication. Across the organization, all discretionary spending has been reviewed. Obviously, out-of-province travel and conferences have been cut to the bone, as are special projects, professional fees. We are seeing savings from not operating buildings and providing programs. Those savings have been baked into the budget, and contracts have been reviewed to see what can be adjusted, and those contracts where we are recommending a service reduction in the business unit, we have identified for council's consideration. Next slide. In addition to looking at the operating budget, staff looked at the current capital budget. We have presented a capital budget that proposed $316.2 million worth of new and carryover projects. Project managers were asked to review the project list to see what projects were being impacted by COVID-19, either through supply chain, lack of materials, or out-of-province procurement. These projects have been recommended for deferral. And as a result of that exercise, we freed up about $100 million in cash flow that we can use to support the ongoing operations of the municipality. There's a complete list of projects in attachment C of the staff report that you'll see and I'm sure you'll have questions on. So next slide. Table on this chart shows the impact of budget reductions and cash flow deferral by asset class. I want to explain the difference in the language that we are using here. The reduction amounts are changes to the bottom line of the budget. This is where savings from capital and operating is coming from, or debt and reserve withdrawals. The deferrals are generally related to cash flow, and that is what is referred to as a carryover. Funding would have been in previous year's budgets. The largest changes are in roads, active transportation, and bridges. Cogswell accounts for 26 million, Spring Garden Road Streetscape is 7.5 million, and Street Recap is 4 million of the balance, and with the balance spread over a number of areas. It doesn't mean we're not doing those projects, they're just going to be delayed somewhat due to a number of factors in relation to any one of those projects. In the vehicle asset class, the change is solely to the delivery of conventional buses and buses required for a moving forward together plan. Transit was advised by the supplier they would not be able to deliver them until June or July of 2021. And because we pay when we receive buses, it is a cash flow change, which will provide some relief on that front. Next slide. In relation to changes to the HRM budget, these are the total organization-wide proposed budget reductions the directors have brought forward. The biggest change is a reduction in capital from operating by 25 million, as discussed on the previous slide. The next largest reduction is compensation. As I stated earlier, there are no further permanent layoffs contemplated as part of this budget. These savings are the results of layoffs already taken and announced, a hiring freeze, and increased vacancy management. I would now like to move into specific business unit target reductions. So I am not going to go into detail on all of them. You would have received the detailed business unit adjustments in attachment D of the staff report. We have grouped some of the numbers for presentation purposes, so there are maybe some differences between the detailed sheets and the slides. We have attempted to capture those budget adjustment list items that are being recommended for a reduction, as well we have a description of reductions that the business unit directors feel council will be particularly interested in. For some of the initiatives that were on the budget adjustment list, these were new services and programs, so reducing them is really going back to status quo in some cases. I am going to start with Transportation and Public Works. They have a number of proposed service reductions, and there's one change to green cart pickup that we would like direction on today, so contracts can be amended. So we definitely need direct council's direction on that because we have a deadline of May the 15th to serve notice to the contractors. So we'll have some further conversation about that today or tomorrow. We definitely need direction prior to this Friday by formal motion of council. So in relation to TPW, you can see a projected loss of revenue totaling $1.381 million. The largest loss is parking meter fine and parking meter revenue, or parking permit revenue, sorry. To stop further revenue loss, it is recommended that all parking fees, fines, and permits resume in June. We're recommending that weekly organics collection not proceed this summer, achieving 1.15 million in savings, and this budget decision is required no later than May 15th in order to provide contractual notice to the haulers. That means we're to be simply reverting to bi-weekly collection. Tree planting and pruning, no trees would be planted in 2021 and tree pruning would be reduced by 20%. The senior snow removal program, contract with the YMCA has expired, and we're proposing to cut the program for this year at a $600,000 saving. Pavement marking or line painting, there was an approximate contract cost increase of $415,000, and staff is proposing to offset those increases by one, only painting transverse markings in the core once this year, and only painting longitudinal markings on arterial roads, and not proceeding with either new or repainted rainbow crosswalks. The only savings transferred to the LED reserve is the amount needed for the principal and interest payment required. Inflation growth on contracts is reduced from a 2% assumption to a 1% assumption. Next slide, we're going to Halifax Transit. Big driver here is loss of revenue. Transit fare, $20 million. We assume that fares will start to be collected in June. However, the ridership will not reach pre-COVID levels this year, and I'm guessing not next year either. Given all the challenges with transit service, staff are recommending not moving forward with the Moving Forward Together plan this year, and this is an item that was on the budget adjustment list. Rural funding reductions, this covers the increase, and this covers the increase to must-go rider and the reduction in kilometers driven. It's just a likelihood. We are seeing significant savings in fuel costs and vehicle expenses. Changes in vehicle expenses and fuel usage related include service reductions to conventional bus service at $990,000 and excessive bus at $201,000. All of this is being eroded by the need for increased cleaning to keep staff and the public safe. Next slide, Parks and Recreation. The big story there is closing of facilities and cancellation of the spring and summer programming that accounts for a revenue loss. Hotel levy transfer will be virtually non-existent. These are the funds that get transferred to Discover Halifax. In addition, there's typically a similar amount that is transferred to the reserve that supports major events. That will also be reduced significantly. The savings from cancellation of spring and summer recreation program is reduced slightly with the closing and then reopening of the parks. There were increased costs that were incurred, and if restrictions are further relaxed, we wanted to have some budget available to meet maintenance requirements and to address program costs. Events and grants have some funding remaining for virtual events as well as Christmas and New Year's, but most of the funding for both HRM civic events and event grants has been reduced. There's some funding for professional arts as well. In relation to planning and development, we have built in lost revenue from foregoing sidewalk cafe fees. Reductions to contracting and consulting services include the Lake Minook weed harvesting, water quality testing for beaches, although there are some funds remaining for the blue-green algae bloom response. Funding for the 3 new Halifax 2050 positions on the budget adjustment list are removed, and we will look to internal resources to effectively advance that work. So we're not saying we're not going to do the work, we're just going to do it differently. Feral cat trap, spay, neuter, and release program is reduced by 50% due to restricted vet clinics operations. All grant programs that were on the budget adjustment list have been cut with the exception of the Food Action Plan initiatives. In relation to Halifax Fire and Emergency, fire services has brought forward a number of options to meet their target. Reductions to the volunteer firefighter honorarium. They're proposing to reduce overtime, excuse me, by $1 million and close station to shift resourcing to the Eastern Shore, where there's a desperate need for protection. They're also reducing the budget adjustment list asked for increased uniforms and training materials. In relation to Halifax Regional Police, the board met yesterday. There's been some further direction given by the board to the chief, and once that's completed, we'll be back to the board on Thursday for a formal recommendation to council on their budget. The school not going in until September, crossing guards costs have been reduced. The youth advocacy program will see a 10% reduction based on this recommendation, and overtime and court savings are due to courts being closed and the impact of COVID-19 state of emergency on policing costs. In relation to the next slide, in relation to Halifax Public Libraries, many thanks to OSACation and the board for their recommendation associated with meeting their new budget targets. outstanding work there. The libraries have included the increased provincial operating funding that was announced after the HRM budget was financialized, and this is an additional $358,000. The library's self-generated revenue is projected to be down significantly during the time of social distancing, including parking, room rentals, fines, and fees. The library board has adjusted these figures further since the presentation was made, and an additional revenue loss of $125,000 will be captured in vacancy management. This budget assumes there will be no large gatherings in the current fiscal year that will have an impact on the ability to rent Paul O'Regan Hall at the Central Library, a very popular venue for a number of events. Of course, books and periodicals are increased in response to the demand for electronic books. So again, kudos to OSA and her team for the outstanding work in keeping the library service available during this particular time. It's been an extraordinary effort, and I'm sure residents appreciate that work. Next slide. Office of the Auditor General. I believe the Auditor General forwarded her budget reductions directly to Regional Council, and as you can see, they are compensation related. If you have any questions, the AG is available to answer them. In relation to my business unit and the CAO business unit, majority of the cuts are discretionary. We've reduced local travel and parking by $40,000. Advertising promotion has been cut by $58,000. Conferences and out-of-town travel by $113,000. Vacancy rate changes of $149,000. We had $135,000 for the Halifax Partnership 5-year economic strategy, and this has been removed, and we've replaced it with $75,000. Further to the motion this morning, that $75,000 is in my budget for the economic recovery plan in response to COVID-19. So everybody understands, my business unit includes the Mayor's Office, Council Support Office, and Government Relations and External Affairs, including the Public Safety Officer, and all of my office staff. So it's that's what's included in there. That's why you see the numbers that are fairly significant in terms of total dollars being cut out of that budget. In relation to corporate and customer services, they're proposing changes to the citizen contact centers and 311 after hours. They're proposing to permanently close the Scotia Square location and close the Acadia School location. And these measures would result in layoffs. Corporate and customer services is experiencing savings in buildings as well as fuel savings in corporate fleet. In relation to human resources and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, there's funding remaining for online training, so we'll continue some training, but it'll all be online for staff. And I must say the HR team does an outstanding job in online training. If you ever looked at that programming, it's pretty impressive. Awesome job there. The long service awards are recommended to be cut under the special projects and events. There is funding for diversity. However, there is funding for diversity and inclusion events. Under legal and legislative, the majority of savings is compensation from approved budget adjustment list positions not being filled this fiscal and other vacancy savings. You may recall, Council approved some new positions with the hiring freeze I imposed earlier this year. They will not be filled. So John has identified some other vacancy savings that can be used to meet the target. As with other business units, spending on travel and training has been reduced, as well as office costs. In addition, reduction to external legal fees and prosecution costs. There's also an increase in litigation insurance recoveries. In relation to finance, asset management, and ICT, they're projected to lose $1.6 million in revenue, mainly related to parking fees and facility rentals and leases. We're recommending eliminating the additional funding for Microsoft licenses. This was to allow all employees in HRM to have an active directory account, an email account. We will be pushing that out for another year. Vacancy rate is very high in this business unit, and that's due primarily to the hiring freeze and impacts ICT predominantly. The additional funding for citizen surveys is also being removed because it was felt that this is not the right time to move forward with a citizen survey. This survey was to gather information to inform Council's next 4-year strategic plan. Funding for VOLTA has remained in the budget. I've already spoken about a number of reductions in fiscal. On slide 44, revenue is projected to decline by $12.8 million. That's second only to transit. Valuation allowance for uncollected tax or uncollectible taxes is $10 million, which I already mentioned. And the 6-month repayment for short-term loans is also included along with the reduction in capital from operating. Next slide. As I said at the outset, Mr. Mayor, and you have seen through reductions that are being put forward, this has been a very difficult but necessary task. The impact of COVID-19 on the fiscal sustainability of the municipality is deep and far-reaching. I do want to once again thank the directors and their staff for all of their hard work. These are not easy decisions to make or conversations to have. These are not normal times. With that, I would like to put the recommendation before you, and I thank you for your patience in hearing this presentation, and we all look forward, Jane and I and the rest of the team, to your questions. Thank you very much, and merci beaucoup.
Okay, Jacques, I'm going to go to the Deputy Mayor to put the motion on the floor.
Thank you very much. I move that the Budget Committee direct the Chief Administrative Officer to revise the 2020-2021 proposed operating and capital budgets as voted on by Regional Council's Committee of the Whole on Budget at their February 12, 2020 meeting, using the revisions proposed in the staff report dated May 1st, 2020, as summarized in Table 3, supported by attachments C and D. I so move.
All right.
Councillor Nicol seconds.
Seconded. Oh.
Seconded by Councillor Nicol. Councillor Deputy Mayor, did you wish to say anything about it at this point?
Not at this point. No, I'll come back at a future date. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Councillor Adams is the one who had.
Can I interrupt, if I may? I would like to go on the speakers list. It just won't go. I can't get on the list. It's just okay. Yeah. So if you could put me on the list. Thank you.
Okay, so it's kind of hard not to be able to see people's faces, and making a list. So there's a couple ways we can go. One is we can just have, get people's thoughts, ask questions, almost like a clarification, or we can go right to the debate and look at amendments. Kind of hard to get any kind of consensus. So I'll go with the list I have, and it starts off with Councillor Adams, who had signaled his intent to bring an amendment forward.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I can appreciate that the difficulty that our staff and everyone else is facing with respect to this. I'd like to bring Council's attention to a couple items under Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency. Those two items are, one, a reduction to the volunteer recognition program in the amount of $770,000. And perhaps if the chief is on the line, he can explain what that is. The second part is to reduce overtime and close Station 11, relocate staff to Sheet Harbor with day staff from Station 50 or 60, which is $1 million expenditure. So I've had a number of different versions of the motion, but I have one that has been approved by legal, and that's the important part. I move that staff be directed to prepare a supplemental staff report identifying alternative funding sources for the $1,770,000 required to permit an amendment to delete the line items with respect to closing Station 11 and the possible transfer of day staff from Station 50 or 60 and the reduction to HRFE Volunteer Fire Recognition Program.
Whitman, second.
Yeah.
So that's the motion, and I'll just speak briefly, if I could, to them both.
If I could, I'll save your time here, but if we're going to be going right to amendments, it's going to be kind of cumbersome to keep track, and I'm looking for advice, perhaps from Jane. Jane, are you on the line with us? We getting kicked back? I'm getting kicked back.
Mr. Mayor.
Should we do this the way we sort of do the original budget, which is that we sort of keep almost like a parking lot, or how would you, do you have any suggestions as to how we can manage this process?
I would recommend that we track any of the amendments that go forward. Council
staff will be coming back with recommendations on how to address any items that get added back on. So we would track them. I would recommend that we track them the same way as the parking lot. Can you hear me okay?
Sort of. I'm getting some kickback. So I'm wondering if we could do the amendment such, Councillor Adams, that we could add to that so that staff could go and come back on those. Councillor Adams?
That's the intent for a supplemental report to come back.
Okay, so this is for a supplementary report.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jane, that works, eh?
Yes, it does, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, go ahead, Councillor Adams.
Thank you, Worship. In this, I've had a number of discussions with individuals in fire, a number of discussions with individuals in the community of Herring Cove, and to change the staffing model right now in Herring Cove is simply not acceptable. Brand new station there a number of years ago, and to change that, just I understand there had to be cuts, but I've never supported cuts in police or fire on my 28 years plus on council. I'm not about to start today. Even with some of the recommendations that came forward a few years ago with regard to stations in Dartmouth, where we had some recommendations of this, I would support that. And I dare say that if it's now volunteers in Herring Cove who are highly skilled and very capable, but they're not in the station. They're not right there at the time of a call that comes in. And the other one is with respect to the recognition program for volunteers. Volunteer firefighters are the core of communities outside the core of the city of Halifax and Dartmouth. And these individuals are there day and night. And this recognition program is just a little thank you to them, and it's just something that we should keep in place. So the motion is simply to prepare a report, come back, and look at options how we could fund these two items that I've identified. Thank you.
Okay, so colleagues, so all of the directors are available for discussion. Jacques, I believe, correct?
That's correct, Mayor. Mr. Mayor, the directors and their senior staff are all available to answer questions. Okay.
So, Councillor Adams, did you have a question directed to Chief Stubing, or?
Well, I know what these particular items are. If members of council have questions about them, it's fine. But it's, I've explained a rough overview. But again, it's simply asking for a staff report to come back. And
okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just trying to figure this out. It looks like we're going to have to do the roll call vote on everything that people want to put on.
Correct.
So it's not going to be a short process. But then, you know what? We're all young. So
point of order, Mr. Mayor. This is
Wade.
It's Councillor Mason. Perhaps we can check with the solicitor. In other Robert's Rules of Order kind of scenarios, you can ask if there is consensus, and you only have to do the roll if there isn't. And that might keep us from having to go through that process.
Our challenge is that our process requires a recorded vote on each motion. Which deviates from Robert's Rules of Order. So in order to track who voted in favor or opposed on any particular motion, we have recorded these. So that's kind of where we're stuck, I think.
Okay. Okay, so on Councillor Adams' motion, I see a bunch of speakers. Who?
I have a question first, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, just a sec now. I've got a list though here. So Councillor Mason, you're not on Councillor Adams' motion? Okay. Councillor Austin?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And, this is kind of Councillor Adams' motion, kind of not. It's more about the procedure of what we're doing here. To get a presentation that then just has like one sheet for each department, And then we're off into debate about adding things into the budget. I mean, I was really hoping that we would have questions on the high level for the budget and then into department by department, similar to what we do with the normal budget. I know it's hard to do right now. We're all on teleconference, but as you say, we're all young. And right now, I mean, I have no idea what I'd be voting on other than, well, I guess it's keeping the station in Herring Cove open and some stuff for the volunteers. I don't have anything in front of me, and I haven't had a chance to ask any of the high level stuff about reserves and, like, you know, the broad picture before getting into the specific. So I find it really hard to be making any sort of decision right now. So, I mean, I'll deal with this if I have to, but I would really prefer if we go back and actually do a sort of high level look before we get into this nitty gritty by department by department.
Yeah, that would have been my preference. I just don't know how we're going to, you know, you can't stop people from making amendments. Councillor, who else on Councillor Adams' motion? Councillor Walker on Councillor Adams?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question was going to be on procedure at the very start and how we were actually going to do the budget and get into this budget. I have this awful feeling in my stomach right now. We're going to do it bit by bit all over the place and without any real direction. And I would have liked to start with Jane or Jock saying, where do you want to start with this budget before we go taking things in and out? I know where I stand on Councillor Adams' motion, but at this point, I don't know whether it's actually should be dealt with at this time. I'll leave it at that.
No, I asked Jane if she had a preference, and she said to do this way and put things into a sort of parking lot.
So Jane's suggestion is that we're going to jump over everybody's budget one at a time and come back to the fire department. Somebody else has something or something they forgot, or
I think so. Jane, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, when you asked me about the preference for the parking lot, I thought you were speaking specifically about amendments. I think that there is some value in setting up the high level conversation about what the budget is, some of the challenges that we're facing, if that is the wish of council. It was more on the process of how we move things forward for any changes once we get into specific line by line items.
So, Mr. Mayor, I think we should just postpone Councillor Adams' motion right now and tackle it at a high level and come back to that when we get to the fire department.
Second.
So this is the trick that I was trying to get at, but I can only see three faces at a time.
I know.
And trying to figure out the process. This is not something we've ever done before. Councillor Adams, are you okay if we hold your amendment in abeyance? Councillor Adams?
Mr. Mayor, it's John Traves. Just suggest that if Councillor Adams is prepared to withdraw his amendment at this point in order for questions of clarification and a discussion generally, you might allow him to move his amendment first later. And we will use that as the start of a parking lot, and then from there we can add other things. And in terms of the question Councillor Mason had with respect to voting, you know, I apologize, I forgot we're in committee of the whole on budget. I think if there's a general consensus to move something, and we've tracked those who are opposed to it, that would certainly help move things along. In terms of, as long as you're satisfied as the chair of the meeting that there is a consensus of the majority to move something into what will become a parking lot, I think you'll be fine with that.
Well, I certainly think we can do something similar to the House of Commons, where you ask for yeas and nays, and if there's not consensus, then you go to a head-by-head vote. So we can do that. But Councillor Adams, Councillor Adams, are you okay?
Well, yeah, I will. And withdrawing it sounds like you're quitting. Perhaps if we could defer it to a later point in our meeting, I'd be have less problem problematic for me. My issue with this, and I'm fine with going that way, whatever way is procedurally fine. My issue is that we were asked if we had any amendments we wanted to make or any motions we want to put forward, and I followed the procedure, put them in, had staff look at them, and even Mr. Traves approved it. He's the one that came up with the final wording, and now we can't do it. So I know this is a new process for everybody, but we have a new process, so we can't just change the new process before the new one gets a chance.
Yeah.
So I'm fine with dealing with this at another time, as long as we have assurances that it'll be addressed.
Yeah, no, we ask, as we do for all the meetings, if people want to get on the list in advance, they can do that, and that's what I do. And you had an amendment, so that's why it was a little bit tricky. But as I said at the beginning, I would like it if we could just sort of almost do clarification or questions on the general principle and then start to make a list. So I'm entirely comfortable with that. So if we can, I'll go to the list that we have. Questions on the overall budget before we get in, and the overall financial situation that we're in, questions of clarification, and then we will come back and start a parking lot list, beginning with Councillor Adams's motion. So I think that's good. So I have, I think I have Councillor Mason. Are you done, Councillor Mason?
No, that was on the procedure. I do have some questions about the budget presentation, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So thank you, staff, for an incredible amount of work in a very short period of time when you had, like, let's just acknowledge you had a lot of other stuff to deal with and a lot of operational impacts to deal with. So my questions are around the assumptions that got us to this point. So we have assumptions that our cash flow is going to be deeply impacted, but we don't have details about the what and the when of that, right? We don't know when, how deep we think the residential and commercial tax are going to be. We got some clarity during the presentation, but to me, I would really like to see some numbers, in columns of quarterly or monthly about what we think bottom looks like and when. A budgetary impact that is unclear to me is the $10 million that's being set aside that's required under the provincial financial rules. Is that an allowance for bad debt, or is that is that the worst we think it's going to be in terms of bad debt? And if so, then the next question for me was the $31.4 million debt servicing charge. Now, my understanding is the provincial program is interest payment only at 6 months, and then first interest and principal payment at a year. So that would be next fiscal in June. We would have potentially a payment, which we don't know how much that payment would be because we don't know how much we're going to have to borrow on the line of credit. But the $31.4 million is being treated as an expense on our revenue and expense rather than being the principal being recouped from the cash flow. We're borrowing money on the line of credit largely because we know that some commercial and some residential are going to be slow to pay us taxes and are going to be on some kind of payment plan, or are going to just default and have a lien on the property and go through that process. But ultimately, paying back that $188 million, if it's being used for taxes that haven't come in, that would not be an expense. That would come from out of cash flow. The principal, not the interest, would be an expense payment. So the $31.4 million really surprised me. That's a lot more than the $2.068 million that I calculated is the most we would pay after a year on the entire $188 million. So I need to understand the differences there. So without that cash flow analysis, it's hard for me to understand, how appropriate the proposed capital and operating cuts are. One thing I will say is I suspect there's going to be a lot of things like Councillor Adams brought up, like the fire stations. I certainly have a list. I'm not going to touch capital right now. I just want to drill down into operating. But I am going to urge council to consider, and I'd like staff's assessment on that. We moved $25 million from capital and operating back into operating, and in part because we can't borrow money to finance a operational deficit. I wonder why we wouldn't move the last 20.5 million of capital from operating. We can finance that over a much longer period of time as a capital project. I think the amortization in that can be 10 or 15 years. And that would put another 20.5 million back into the operating budget for this year to help avoid some of the cuts that are being proposed. I know we need to tighten our belts and we need to cut. My concerns are twofold. One is that the hiring freeze and the various staff impacts are going to hit us where we need it the most right now. I know our staff are experiencing what most counselors are experiencing, which is you're working from home and you're working harder than ever, but you're not as productive as you'd like to be, and you have even more work on your to-do list than because of COVID. And so Halifax 2050, not getting those 3 people, not having people to help with the tactical and the AT and the IMP and all the aggressive stuff we talked about during the council meeting to help adjust the community over the next 2 years, the physical community, to be able to accommodate social distancing and health. That's a huge concern for me. And I'll close on this because I know I'm eating a lot of time, is the other part of the budget that I have a lot of issues with are cutting community grants to our partners, to events, to arts groups. You know, what we're seeing is all these folks, like, they still have to pay rent, and some of them, they've laid off some staff, but they still have core costs they can't get rid of. And if we say, well, we're just not even going to do any kind of grants this year, then we are going to contribute to the failure of historic arts organizations and community organizations that are at their weakest, that need us the most right now. So I really need to understand what's proposed there, and have we talked, you know, about what that impact's going to look like, because it's going to be devastating, and there's no doubt about it. I'd like to understand, I'd like compensation broken down, what that 20 million bucks in compensation is, how much of that is what's already been announced, how much of that is vacancy, and I'd like to see more details on the cash flow. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Those are my preliminary observations.
Okay, Jane, do you want to take some of those? Or Jacques?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So on the assumptions for the $188 million, so that covers the full year. So that would be the original, shifting the April interim bill to June 1st, and then as well the October 31st tax payment. So what we did in doing this work was we went through every assessment classification, if you will, and grouped them by type. So we have nonprofit organizations, we have small businesses that we've defined under $2 million in assessment. We have the hospitality industry, hotels, motels, healthcare providers. So we've gone through and broken them out. We also have landlords, so commercial, shopping plazas, and then apartments for 4 units and over. We went through and then assigned what we think the non-payment factor will be. So we discounted those tax bills. So for example, in hospitality, we're assuming that restaurants and bars, they are not going to be able to pay any of their taxes. So we have taken a very, very pessimistic view on this. Actually, a very pessimistic view on this, not very, very. And so we went through there. On the, so we did that for the commercial and apartments, and I can certainly send the calculation sheet out to all councillors if you like. I can certainly provide that. We also have on homeowners, we looked at the residential and we took a 25% rate of residential homeowners not being able to pay their taxes. This is actually a little bit lower than some municipalities, and that's being driven primarily by the fact that we have you know, typically when you look at demographics, we have high professionals, working civil servants, universities, those sorts of areas. And then we also have a high demographic of retired people who tend to pay their taxes. So when we did that on the residential, that's $90 million. On the commercial and the apartment, that adds up to 98. So that's really how we did that. We are monitoring the cash as it comes in every day. So we look at cash flow on a daily basis to see what's coming in and coming out. So on the valuation.
Can I ask one question just on that? When you analyzed restaurants and bars and the other commercial categories, did you look at properties that are owned by the operator? Because certainly a lot of bars aren't paying rent, but most of them don't own their buildings, and they're usually, most of them are buildings that have different types of businesses in them. So their landlords presumably will still be paying some or all of the tax. So how granular did you get in that analysis?
It's pretty granular. So it is based on ownership. It's not based on occupancy or business type. So we did dig into that a fair bit. We've also, since we received the, on April the 30th, we took the data that was the payments that came in and did another run to analyze where we're seeing the payments coming in. What we aren't seeing is the big commercials. They have not paid, by and large, their tax bill. I'm not too concerned about that because I assume they're just holding their cash until the tax bill due date. So those are the things that we're watching for. The valuation allowance, it's accounting. What it is you set aside the amount of tax revenue that you don't think that you're going to receive. And this is either because people don't pay or you have assessment appeals. Typically, we run about a $3 million valuation allowance, and typically people will say, well, you always get your tax revenue because you can go to tax sale. You can. The tax sale takes quite a long time. The other thing is we've never seen anything like this before. And it's based on business conditions, economic conditions and circumstances at that time. If we have a lot of restaurants, hotels on the market, I don't know what the take-up is on that for tax sale purposes. So to be prudent, which is accountants we must be, we've taken a 10 million valuation. I originally had 15 in there, felt it was too high. Is it the right number? We're not sure about that, but I'm comfortable with that number. So that's how that number came about. On the principal and interest, you're exactly right. Under the loan from the province, all we have to pay at 6 months is the interest payment. What I've done, because what we're facing here is a structural problem. This is not just a $44 million revenue loss. This is structural, and what's going to happen to our assessment base. What I'm trying to be is as prudent as possible with the way that we manage the cash. So we're set up for 21-22. If I don't book any repayment, cash repayment, then in 21-22, we will be required to pay $60 million back to the province, assuming the full 188 million. There will be flexibility around that based on where we end up on what we end up borrowing. So the repayment plan that goes back with that, there is no requirement for someone that is in tax arrears to go on a prepayment plan. They don't have to at all. It is a service that we offer because we want to help people stay current on their taxes. We view, quite frankly, a tax sale as a failure. So what we do is we reach out to people, we make people aware of the options that they have to pay their taxes, and we work with them. But there's no requirement to. So there is no guarantee that tax payments, even on a 24-month payment plan, will actually be coming in. So those are some of the other things that go into the mix. On capital from operating, what we did is we looked at every capital project that we have. Every capital project, we need to identify a funding source. So we went through the list of the projects that we could defer or delay, and that's where we came. That's that $100 million. We then tracked back to see how many of those are being funded from capital from operating. When we looked at that, that's how we got the 25 million. A lot of the projects that are being deferred or delayed are really being funded either through cost sharing or reserve. So if you look at vehicles on the buses, I think it's about $24 million. That's all gas tax revenue. So it's not about putting It's not that easy to do that. We actually thought it would be a much easier exercise. I actually thought I'd be able to get all 45 out of cap from operating, but as we dug in and did the work, we ended up at 25, which is still good. We have gone through and identified projects that we could, that in 1920 had been funded through cap from operating. We can shift that into debt. So there's about $54 million there. If we do that, we're paying the principal and interest charges. So it really is every decision that gets made. It's balancing cash flow, which is keeping the lights on, paying the bills. It's balancing what happens to the bottom line on the budget and not going too deep, but also going deep enough so that we're not pushing the problem to 21, 22. So that's really how all of the decisions got made and recommended. I think, compensation, absolutely, we can get you the list on the compensation breakdown.
Jane, I think, so thank you, Wei, you can come back, but I'm getting a lot of notes from councillors that we're not hearing you particularly well. I don't know if you have a headphone or something that you might be able to use, that, but it's a little lighter. And I'm not sure, I was on getting some emails, but did you answer the question on the debt charges that Councillor Mason had asked, the 30 million or 31 million?
Yes, I did. What I said was that was booking the 6 months of principal and interest charges in order to be prudent so that we would have those funds available in 21, 22 when we would have to pay the full year, which would have been 60 million.
Okay. So there's a number of people here, not surprisingly. I'm going to go, I think Councillor Austin is next.
Oh. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I wanted to thank Councillor Adams for agreeing to put his motion first to the parking lot so we can have the high-level discussion now. I think this will make this very difficult thing somewhat easier. I know for my end, there's not a lot of joy in the revised budget. There's a whole lot of things that I look at, and I'm in the same boat where it's like, man, there's nothing but tough choices. So for high-level questions, the reserves, I'm just looking at the spreadsheet. I've got a couple questions about that. Where were we going to be balance-wise before all this happened? Like, because I've got this spreadsheet that shows where we are now, but what I don't have is where we were going to be prior to COVID. The other question, there was reference to the reserve business cases about having to restore them with interest. Is that our business case as part of the reserves, or are those statutory requirements? So let's start with those two.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the councillor. So the where we were going to be on reserve balances was at the end of fiscal 2021. If you had the budget book that was originally presented for the March 24th, page Q2, you would see that we were projecting to have about $168.4 million in reserves at the end of March 2021, so the end of this fiscal. The reserve balance that we're projecting now is 205, but that is with the surplus coming in for fiscal 19-20 estimated at $35 million. We also have some of the BAL items that that were approved previously and we've taken out and increased operating contributions. So we have reworked it somewhat.
But so without the surplus, the reserves are basically, like, if we didn't have that surplus, the reserves are basically where they would have been prior to the recast budget.
Correct.
Okay. What about the business cases well, actually, I'll ask this one first because you've now sparked that one. So in the reserves, as I'm looking at the spreadsheet, I'm seeing things like strategic capital going from 32 to 44 to 55, so that one's still increasing. That one is primarily, if memory serves, that's strategic property sales that were designated and 1 cent on the tax rate. So are we still growing that reserve at the same time that we're hunkered down? Is that what I'm seeing here?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. This is what was projected with the contributions going in. So you are correct. We are still under today's environment. We still have 1 cent going to the tax rate. We are still forecasting property sales. We would have the sale of Bloomfield going in here. So there is a mix of contributions in and out in the reserves.
So, I mean, just from my standpoint, I can understand us trying to preserve reserves we have, but continuing to grow savings while we're also facing all sorts of cuts and difficult choices on the one hand. It doesn't quite make sense to me. The reserve piece about about paying back, if we take money out of some reserves, it was referenced in Jacques' presentation, that we then have to put money back in future. Is that like set out charter requirements, or is that the business cases that we have created that require us to do that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor, it's a combination of both. Under the charter, we are required to have a capital reserve, which is separate apart from our strategic capital reserve. And every time we sell an asset, a capital asset, the money is to be deposited in there and then used for capital purposes. Councils are allowed to borrow from that, but under legislation, it has to be paid back and has to be paid back with interest. The landfill closure reserve is also one that's required by legislation. On the parkland reserve, that is the deposit that we get from developers if they don't give parkland and they designate that. And then on the other ones, on the business cases, some of them do indicate that interest earned should go back into the business case. That's a council decision and one that could be adjusted.
So just to clarify, then there's about 3 of our reserves. The capital one sounds like it's the most restrictive. Parkland 2 because it's being paid by developers. But some of these reserves, if we so decided, we would have to change the business cases around them. But there's no legislative for a good chunk of it that would preclude it. It's simply our own policies that have set that in place.
Correct, and the CIO mentioned in the presentation that we would be coming back with a report that essentially allows, with the approval of regional council, the CFO and CAO to really go outside of the business case for the reserve. So looking at what the use was, setting that aside, and allowing us to draw that down as needed, and look at it that way. That would be for fiscal 2021 in order to give us flexibility and room. In that we can, certainly we can recommend not making payments into certain reserves unless we are legislatively required to do so.
Okay, I think I've probably gone beyond 5 minutes. I've reached the end of my reserve questions, so I'll circle back around for my other high levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Karsten.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And unlike Councillor Austin, I will keep this to 5 minutes. Mr. Mayor, I just want to start, I think, by acknowledging the work that staff have done. And, I can't imagine the number of hours that they've spent in bringing us the document from that we got on the weekend or Friday. We were this close. We were this close to having a budget in draft form that was close to being approved. And then, of course, COVID hit. So I do have a couple questions of Jane. When COVID struck, it wasn't too many weeks, Mr. Mayor, as you know, that, and I have to reference on at least one occasion, the work FCM is doing. It wasn't that many weeks into COVID that we actually did say that this is much more than a financial crunch. This is much more than just cash flow shortage, to a problem with our liquidity. That in fact, this is at some point going to affect our vital services and programs. And that's when we stepped forward, Mr. Mayor, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, through big city mayors and others, to say to the federal government that our cash flow shortages or the revenue losses look to be in excess of 10, but to 10 to 15 billion. And we're calling on the federal government to backstop those financial losses for municipalities across the country. So I have two basic questions. Number one, Jane, in a perfect world, when would you hope, now that we're starting today to revisit this budget reset, when would you hope to have this finalized? I understand we have no legislative date that we have to meet, but when would you hope to meet it? And I guess my question as it relates to the timeline is, if and obviously the advocacy is continuing, and no, I don't have an inside bit of information to share with you. I wish I did, but if within the next 2 weeks, the federal government did come up with a program, what would that do to our budget moving forward? If in fact, depending on when council moves forward with approving this, what staff presented, if that were to happen after the budget's actually approved, what would happen? You know, I just, obviously we're in a crisis mode across the country. I can't say enough, Jane and Jacques, for the work that staff have done, the executive management team and others, the work that's in this document. I know Bruce Fisher had his hand in it. And quite frankly, it's as good a document as anything I've seen in the 16 years I've been here. And, you know, we can go around the horn, folks, a dozen times. You know, we're all, every municipality, every citizen in this country, every resident in HRM are going to feel pain throughout this process. And I almost implore us to really stick as close as possible to what staff are saying. There's no magic bullet here. I mean, we can go around and add and delete as many times as we want to. At the end of the day, this municipality is going to come in at somewhere around not only the 58 million reduction in this budget, as I understand it, but somewhere around 232 million in total, Jane. So you probably, I'm sure, captured those questions. When do you hope to have this finalized? What if the federal government, in partnership perhaps with the provinces and territories, were to come up with a program? What would that do to our budget if it happens sort of simultaneous to the approval of this? And, you know, maybe even touch on the number of hours you folks have spent on this. You know, this isn't something we asked for. We were close to a finalized budget that I think all of council could have lived with. And again, I just say, let's stick as close to what staff are suggesting as humanly possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillors. So certainly on the timing, we don't have a budget, so there is some, you know, there are some challenges with signing contracts if we don't have a budget. You know, I expect that, so we're scheduled for May 26th to have the vote on the final budget. I expect that there's an appetite at council to say, well, let's wait and see what happens on June the 1st to see what the revenue numbers are. And I can understand that. So, you know, certainly the first week of June is fine. The reality is June is only going to tell us half of the story. It is October, and the longer term structural impacts that are really what the issue is for me on that. So it's about being able to get the budget finalized so that we have some certainty and we're moving forward with that. Every day that we delay makes the reductions that much harder. It's just a fact. On the lobbying for other orders of government funding, absolutely. If we receive funding from either the federal or provincial governments, we can add that back. So we would come back to council with a structured approach, and it's really going to depend on what the terms and conditions are for the funding. So we would come back. So it's always easier to add things back in, and that's the way that it's been built a bit. One of the reasons, two reasons why we haven't recommended a tax increase in the budget is, one is that if people are having a hard time paying their bills now, it seems counterintuitive to increase the taxes for them, especially on the commercial side of the house. The other thing is, if we vote a budget that has a tax increase in it, we can't haul that back if for some reason that the trough isn't as deep, or if we get funding from the federal government. So those are really some of the things that are in there. It is a stepped approach. We can add back. We can be responsive to any federal funding that comes through. You know, and I think we all acknowledge that you know, when these federal and provincial programs are announced, it does take a little while for the administration to stand them up. So there will be a time lag.
Mr. Mayor, just in closing, I know I've probably now gone over, but just to say that for anyone that's concerned about this budget, you know, you're calling your councillors. We're getting lots of emails. Like, advocate for the financial request that's out there for the federal government. Call your MPs. Get active. We can't do a good recovery in this country with municipalities leading the way in recovery if we're strapped for cash and hurting. So we need this funding, and we continue to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to take a 1-minute break. I think, Jane, that Corey has some headphones there for you.
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
And you're coming across more clearly already, but let's just take do what you need to do, perhaps. Do we need to take a full break? Do you want to turn your camera off, or Jane, are you?
Not even say 5 minutes.
Corey said we can probably have it done in 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. We're gone. What happened here?
We're going to continue after a break.
Who decided that?
I think that's what we thought was happening. Just tell him.
Keep 6 feet distance.
Are we taking a few minutes?
I don't know what I think if we just hold on, and we're going to get right back to this as soon as because we're going to quit at 4:30 for the day and come back tomorrow. So I want to make use of our time until then.
Testing, James. How do we hear?
Yeah, I heard something.
We can hear that. That's clear.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Better.
Okay.
You didn't sound like Jane, though.
Jane, you back? Jane, how are you?
I'm good. Can you hear better now?
I think so, yeah.
All right, we'll get that sorted. We're all disinfected and Corey's away.
All right. Awesome, Jane. Thank you. Councillor Walker. Councillor Walker?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And my questions are much on like Councillor Karsten's. I do expect to get some money from the province and from the federal government to help us with this budget. And I guess my main concern is what's going to get put back in. And I know you said things will be put back in, but what would be put? Is there, at this high level, do you have any thoughts on where it would go back?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So it would really depend on the type of program that's stood up by the other orders of government and what the eligibility criteria is around that. And then it would be, I think we really need to determine it. It depends on the time of year as well, and look at where the service reductions have occurred and what needs to come back in. And then there would be a recommendation done, certainly with senior management led by the CIO for council recommendation. So it is very challenging to be able to give you an answer right now without knowing what the criteria is.
And my second question at this point in time, because I do agree with about 90% of the cuts that are before us today, but some of them I have a problem with, and I would still like a better go around of what reserve, if we really, really, really had to, could it come from? Because I'm not sure in my mind that some of this money couldn't come from a reserve, not to deplete the reserve or anything, but maybe some of it could come from a reserve to help us out here. And at this point, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Jacques, you wanted to weigh in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Jane, for those answers as well. And thanks, Councillor Walker, for your question. Just to add to what Jane was saying, there's really two approaches to try to get federal provincial funding. One is the transit piece, and that's really focused on the federal government and whether or not they will come in and support transit systems. So whatever that is, they would go directly to a transit service, to our transit service. We don't know what the criteria will be. The more compelling one in my mind is whether they would come in on infrastructure. So, we've sent in the shovel-ready list to the province, right, of projects that are ready to go. They're interested in rolling out as many projects as they can, provincially and federally, to kickstart the economy. So, if we could get some money for shovel-ready projects that we were going to fund at 100%, and then automatically there will be some money there that we can take out of the operating, the capital from operating could be reduced potentially. And then that money could be either reassigned or repurposed in some fashion. So, let's just assume, for example, we were able to get $20 million from each level of government for the shovel-ready list. If there's $40 million, that would automatically potentially wipe out our requirement to put capital from operating in and free up maybe $15 million in cash for council to consider investing in other things, right? And putting stuff back into the budget per se, right? But as Jane said, we would come back to you with some advice on that and saying, here are things you may want to consider. This conversation is helpful because we're gonna, we're gonna learn over the next few days what items, you have 90% of the, you're saying you support 90%, we'd like to know what your 10% is. So then we could keep a running tab of that as well, right? So we know if we do get more money, what we can do with that, right?
I do know in my talks with the provincial and federal governments that some money will come, but I would say it'll be more than the transit money because not all municipalities have transit, but they're all in trouble. And I would say that whatever program comes forward has to include everybody. You can't cherry pick, oh, you have transit, we're going to help you, and not everybody. Everybody's hurting here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hensby.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I kind of agree with Councillor Walker in regards to rather go by department presentation by the heads, talk about why they chose what they did, have a better appreciation of the things. Going piecemeal and jumping all over, leapfrogging this budget process, I don't think is the way to go. I think we need to do it in a more systematic approach. And I think I like Russell's idea. Let's go department by department, presentation by presentation, and start do a parking lot analysis from that. Thank you.
So just in terms of that, well, let's continue at the high level. We're not going to get through all the list, and then we can decide if there's more that needs to be done in that direction, David. We have some time. We've got meetings booked tomorrow and one next week if necessary, and we can always add if need be. I would say that Jacques had indicated there are some things that need to be dealt with this week. So for tomorrow, Jacques and Jane, it would be helpful if those things that you need some direction on by the end of this week, we would have to have a look at certainly by tomorrow. Okay.
Thanks for that, Mayor. We will have Brad and John are working on a motion now in relation to that decision we need to have by Friday. So they'll have that for you for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stretch.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, and Jacques and Jane for your presentation. Your Worship, you mentioned when you first opened this debate that you wished you could see councillors' faces. Well, my face was that little emoji on our phone with the head blowing up. That's kind of how I was feeling. And when Jacques said, you know, that he's not an accountant, it's very obvious that he has a lot of good people around him that are, and he's fortunate. Challenging times, absolutely. I know that it's difficult. There's going to be a lot of pain as it relates to bringing this budget forward. But we are sending a message today, and I know that you said you did not want to dwell on specifics, and I agree with that. But I just want to reflect on what Councillor Karsten said a few moments ago, also as his position as president of FCM. The money that they are looking for is to protect and keep in place our vital services. To me, that speaks to emergency services. It speaks to public safety. And there is absolutely no way that I am going to support anything that is going to inhibit that in the rural communities. And that goes right to where Councillor Adams was a few moments ago, and the way that we handle the volunteers going forward, as well as the ground search and rescue. These have to be dealt with, and I look forward to revisiting that discussion. You know, especially when the fire budget came forward, didn't speak about reducing anyone else's pay except the volunteers were the low-hanging fruit. So there's no way that that is the message I'm going to be part of sending. I also want to make it clear that I'm very supportive of the no tax increase proposal. The cuts that Jacques and Jane have brought forward, I think, best attempt. I am not interested either in an ad nauseum discussion around how we can wordsmith or change little by little, but the message, the big picture is very important, and I think public safety and continued support of our volunteers is paramount for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree actually with Councillor Stretch with regard to the public safety, and I'll get into details when we actually get into department, fire and police specifically. But my high level questions, there's actually two, and I'm not much clearer. I heard it when Jacques' presentation and opening is, I'm trying to understand how you came up with the number that was given to each department to cut. If you could explain to me how you came up with it. Then the other item is, I understand that there are some items that need to be voted on, and as Jacques said, the staff are working on that. We'll have that for us tomorrow that need a more timely. But I'm not understanding why we're not waiting for a final decision on this budget until after June 1st, once we actually know how many of our residents have paid their property taxes. So if you could speak to the timing, the overall timing of approving the recommendations that are in front of us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through Jacques.
Oh, they're fighting over me. That's awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So I'll go first, and then the CAO can certainly come in. So on the assumptions, we did not do a typical across the board cut. because it's deep and different departments have been hit by COVID differently. So for example, Parks and Rec, you will see that they have revenue losses for programming, but as well they have the savings that have been, the expenses offset by that. So what we did was we looked at some of the, we gave some direction on vacancy management. We looked at some of the layoffs that had already been occurred. We factored that into the budget. We looked to see where there was flexibility around such things as contracts and whether or not there was an ability to change the service level. We also looked at some of the assumptions that would have been around the inflation that was in some of the contracts. Obviously, we're seeing big decreases in fuel, gas and diesel, so that hits transit and hits corporate and customer services. So we've adjusted it for that. So some of the adjustments are targeted and based on the impact of COVID. So we could take those out. So that's really what the approach was. Assumptions that we used was that we're back June the 1st with charging parking fees, revenue for transit, that there wouldn't be any spring or summer recreation programming, that the hockey and the rinks and for ringette and skating, everything would open up in October. So that's really how we did it, was taking a number of assumptions. Obviously in Parks and Recreation, we saw the parks open up earlier than anticipated. So we dialed back a little bit of the savings from expenses, so that in the event that programming does start, that there is some money in the budget for either maintenance or for standing up the program. So that's really some of the assumptions that we made.
So on that, Jane, before we go to Jacques, and thank you for that explanation. So when you looked at, I think you're starting to hear a theme from the very few councillors that spoke so far with regard to public safety, and obviously people are referring to fire and police. So how did you make those assumptions of a dollar amount to cut back with fire and police? And I believe at one point in time, I think police, the cutback request was 10 million and it got down to 5.5 million. So can you help me understand how you came up with those numbers for those two departments?
Certainly, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So it really was looking at the mix of their budgets to see what's in there. Some of them and the cost. So based on vacancies, based on other things. When we looked at the original targets that were sent out were much deeper across all departments. So we fine-tuned what the budget gap was on that, and just really it's looking at what the costs are, what the discretionary spending was. In fire came back with a number of items that have been on the BAL budget adjustment list from last year, and things to come back. They are very, very tough targets. There's no doubt about it for everyone, and public safety certainly has has certainly met the target. It's to the best of their abilities.
Thank you, Jane. Jacques, maybe the timing question then. I think Jacques was going to answer that question on the timing.
Quickly.
Yeah, sure. Look, the issue of who pays their taxes when is a cash flow issue, not a budget issue. So right. We're trying to explain that to council that we need a budget to allow us to pay people, to allow us to pay contracts. So we're actually increasing our legal risks around not having a budget, right? So there's a number of contracts that are problematic, and there's a number of expenditures that are problematic as well. Going forward. So, I think you need to think about what's cash flow and what's budget. We need a budget soon. Cash flow we'll manage going forward, and depending on how that works out. Right?
Jacques, is there, last question, is there a drop dead date that you need to have this work done by?
Which work? The budget?
The budget, yes, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, our preference is to stick to the original plan, which was May 26th, I think, or 24th, 26th. So that's not a drop dead date. Could we go another week? Sure. That wouldn't be a huge problem, but like I say, going another week will just sort of let you know where you are on cash flow as opposed to where you are on budget. And Jane made a very important point a while ago, saying the longer you wait for a budget, the more difficult it's going to be, because the savings will be that much more difficult to actually achieve.
Jane and Jacques, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. So colleagues, just in terms of time, I have the following names on the list. We'll probably hear from all these folks. It'll take us past 4:30, and then we'll reconfigure tomorrow. I have Councillor Russell, Zarowski, Blackburn, Whitman, Outfit, Smith, Nicol, and Adams. Councillor Russell.
Thank you very much, and I also want to thank you for the report that we received. I like the level of detail in that it gives us a starting point. We could have more information on each of the items that is listed here. I appreciate that you have included the budget reductions and the further cash reduction should it be required. One of my initial questions, I suppose, is there are a number of items that are not listed for a budget reduction. Is it within the realm of what you're expecting that we would talk about those and put some of them on the table? Or are there things that are absolutely not on the table in your mind?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Russell. So the items that are on the reduction list have come from the directors and from their teams, and is based on, certainly their best judgment, the either contracts that we have signed, service delivery standards, council priorities, and going forward. So it really is, given the mandate that each director has, they have looked at where their spending is and have come forward with the with what they feel is the best approach to take in order for them to meet council's priorities and their mandate, as I said.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would just, if I may, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor, I would also say that, I think Jane made this point earlier, but just to reinforce this point, when we set the initial targets, they were quite aggressive. And in order to achieve those aggressive targets, we were talking about some significant layoffs and some very significant service reductions. And so we've got the initial response from business units. It wasn't something that Jane and I could live with. In other words, we would be coming to you with saying, we're laying off hundreds of people and we're going to cut following services in many areas, including public safety. Police had over 50 layoffs, et cetera, et cetera. Went right across the board, significant layoffs. So we pared back the targets, and what you have now is that. So what we didn't want to put on the table is significant layoffs beyond what we've already put on the table, because we still have to operate the municipality. Everybody that's working for HRM right now is doing meaningful work, and that was an issue for us going forward as to how we manage, how do we actually deliver on council's expectations, citizens' expectations in the COVID reality that we're facing. So that's why you see the recommendations coming back from the directors the way they are. It would have been much, much worse had we stuck to the original targets going forward.
Councillor Russell?
Sure, and I appreciate that, but if there are additional items, then I'm just going to pull one out of the air. We have new transit technology and parking technology. If I were to just say, let's look at that, and what would that take, and what would that involve as far as removing those from the budget for this year? If I add them together, that's almost $6 million. And then we would be able to look at other things that we would that we might be able to keep. Would that be a supplementary report that would have to come back about what that would involve?
Yeah, there are two components to the parking technology. One is the capital side of it, and then there's the operating side, and then there's of course the revenue side of parking as we move forward. So we would have to do some more analysis to come back to you with a conversation about that. Right. Many of these are in flight, and we're contractually obliged. On one hand, we have a contractor. We've already signed contracts around the parking technology piece, so there will be contractual issues that may draw in some lost investment, right? So we'd have to look at that very seriously.
Okay, no, and I appreciate that. I'm going to be looking at all of this and paying attention to the discussion as it comes over the next couple of weeks. With going back to a conversation that we were having during the council meeting. And the main lens that I'm going to be looking at the budget information with is health and safety first. Food security and shelter. Those come first. After that, it'll be dollars and cents. It'll be the economy. So that is what I'm going to frame everything in terms of. And when we look at the fire department reductions that have been requested or proposed or not proposed, it'll be framed within that lens. One of the questions that I've been wondering about is the North American Indigenous Games. I remember that we talked about it a number of months ago. I'm just wondering what sort of impact that might have had on what we see in front of us.
It actually, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor, it actually has really no impact to the extent that we've already committed to hosting the games, and it's now been, of course, deferred till 21. So when we look at the budget for the North American Indigenous Games, we have confirmed that we will provide the funding level that council had already agreed to. That's sort of the way forward. So it really has no significant impact on this year's budget. Not all the money that was provided or committed by council to the North American Indigenous Games has been spent, but there will be a carry forward to next year's event to allow those games to happen, with the federal government and the province likely having to spend more money next year in order to ensure that the games go on. But our commitment is simply to provide the funding level that council had originally committed, both in kind and in cash. And that money's already been set aside.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Russell. I'm going to be strict on time now, and everybody can come back as many times as they wish over the next little while, but we're at 6 minutes. Councillor Zarowski.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it's interesting that Councillor Russell has framed things the way he did, because that's exactly how I frame it. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the rubric of money, and money doesn't care if it goes into one pot or another pot. It's all equal pots, and debt is debt. If you get a MasterCard bill or if you get a Visa bill, it's the same amount of money. However, as councillors and as staff, nothing is equal. We try to equalize things through the rubric of money, but it isn't equal. Some things are more important than others. So a dollar that goes to the fire department, in my assessment, has a different weight than a dollar that goes into Parks and Rec, or a dollar that might go into snow removal or other particular departments that we would have, because they're critical. Fire and police, our social infrastructure and the health of our city depends on it. The health of our community depends on it. And when they fall apart, we lose everything. And so the distribution of the shortfall perhaps needs to be qualified. I'm a quantifying type of person, and it is my fault that I quantify things. But I think in this particular case, it is a social construct that needs to be qualified. And the first thing I have to say is I am so glad, Jacques, that I'm not sitting in your chair. It is such an onerous task, and Jane, to be able to do that and then present it to 17 people whose agendas are totally different. So I'll start off with that particular perspective, that you have an awful job to present. The question that I have is, first of all, if I can list it this way, what if we cut salaries right across the board for every HRM employee, and that includes right up from the top down to the bottom by 10%. Has that been considered, and how much of an impact would that make on our budget considerations? Would it meet our shortfall?
We've spoken about giving back money before, and we've spoken about the fact that perhaps a 10% payback by various staff might be one way of addressing this. And I've also floated the idea of talking with our various unions in order to protect the jobs that we have and to protect at the same time our citizens and constituents, that perhaps on a temporary basis, with assurances that over the next couple of years, as we dig out from the rabbit hole of COVID, that we will then reinstitute those givings back to the city. Is it possible to consider that? And I would like to frame it in that way and ask whether or not that has been a consideration and whether or not that would meet our shortfalls. I'll just leave it at that. I recognize that we're running short on time and I don't want to run over needlessly, but if you could respond to that, both Jacques and Jane, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. That is a matter that touches on the area of human resources, and that's not something I'm prepared to discuss in public. So if you want to return to private, we can have a conversation about that. Thank you.
All right, I can appreciate that. And the only thing I would ask is it a consideration and would it meet the shortfalls that we have?
Again, all I can respond to that is that that's a matter that involves our human resources and our staff, and that was something that I would only be prepared to speak to in camera.
Okay, perhaps I can frame it differently so that I'm
frame it differently quickly
to try to understand the dollar figures. How much would we save if we cut salaries right across the board by 10%? Would that meet our shortfall?
Again, that's a matter of human resources, and I'm not prepared to talk about that in public, and we'll go in camera if you want to have a conversation about it.
All right, I can appreciate that, Jacques, and I do understand. Thank you.
Jacques, would you like to plead the fifth? I guess that's in a different country. Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor.
Like to plead a glass of scotch would now.
Deputy Mayor.
And a cigar. And a cigar.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief, but just want to start by just thank you to you, Jacques, and to you, Jane. I know that the last few weeks, it's been a lot of late nights and a lot of early mornings trying to make this happen. And I appreciate immensely the mountains that you've been able to move in the last few weeks. Just a couple of quick questions. Do we foresee any change at all in the payment schedule for the provincial loan program? To me, 6 months and then we've got to start paying it back doesn't seem like a lot of time. My second question, and please forgive me if this was a part of the report. I looked for it and couldn't find it. What was the final count on our budget surplus for last fiscal year? And third and final, just revisiting, if the federal money ferry does pay us a visit, what would that, how involved would we be in that process to add items back in? I mean, are we in a situation where we're looking at going through budget talks all summer? And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, I'll speak to a little bit about the timing and to the federal, some federal provincial monies that do come in, that may or may not come in. So the timing issue on the loan, as Jane had mentioned earlier, we cannot pile on all the debt payments into 21-22 because we fully expect our revenue stream from taxation will be less than this year. So this year is bad, next year will be worse. So all of a sudden, let's say, for example, we borrow $100 million this year to get through the cash flow, which is a likely number. Then, so we're booking basically a $30 million payment against that, right? And so next year, for example, or maybe in October, we come to realization that less taxes being paid on the October billing than the April billing. So then you're looking at making, borrowing more money. So all of a sudden you have $200 million or $188 million, for example, in this case, that we have the maximum authority to borrow at the moment, given the provincial amount that's been allocated. So all of a sudden your payments in 21-22 are somewhere north of 100 million. Right, so that's, you know, and I don't know if everybody and the people that are listening in the general public realize, but for every $5 million in spending around here increase on the budget, that's paid for by taxation. It's 1 cent on the tax rate, right? So all of a sudden, let's say you have $100 million in debt payments. That's 20 cents on the tax rate. I don't think anybody wants to go there. That's why Jane and I and the rest of the team are being very cautious and very frugal and trying to present to you a resilient budget that that prevents you from having to raise taxes, right? So the timing is really important on this in terms of that payment. So we need to make a payment this year for sure. To the extent that we can make more payments this year, we'll know perhaps in post-October. We certainly won't know post-June, I don't think. I think we'll have to see what the October billing is, and then we're into another budget for 21-22. It's going to be very tough.
Basically, starting to pay it off in 6 months' time is for our own good.
That's correct. Yeah, we need to make a payment for sure. Now, the federal, you know, if the federal government comes in with some money, either on infrastructure or for transit, the application of those monies will definitely come back to council, and you're fully in control of how that money gets reapplied to the budget, should it come in. So, you know, if we're lucky enough to get some short-term money, and I can tell you, I think the province and the federal government also want to try to approve some what I call medium-term projects, which are projects that are probably on our books for to be done within the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years, because they want to continue. They know that this is not a short-term event, so they know that they're going to have to, you know, set up municipalities to be able to plan their capital spending and get money rolling into the economy. So I think we're going to see two ways of looking at two approaches by the senior levels of government. One is short-term money against shovel-ready projects that can be done this year, and you know we're ready to tender a bunch of stuff, and we're tenders on a bunch of stuff. And then the other ones are projects that are next year in 21 and 22 and 23 and possibly 24. That's what I call the medium-term projects, where we're looking for some support there. And I think there's a sincere interest in Ottawa and at Government House here in Halifax to look at those projects and see what they can provide us some commitments so we can get on with planning and fast track some of these projects. And you'll decide as a council as to what that money is used for, or offsets, you know, because if we can get some offsetting capital money to replace some of our capital from operating, then all of a sudden you've got money that, you know, the 25 million that's in there now, you'll be able to look at that and say, well, here's what we'd like to put back into the budget, the operating budget, with that money. I don't know if that helps.
All right, no, perfect. And just a final count on the budget surplus for last fiscal.
Yeah, Jane, can you weigh in on that one?
Certainly, Jacques. So we're still going through year end, but we're projecting to have a surplus of $35 million, driven primarily by deed transfer tax. That came in at 61 million in 1920.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much.
On the deed transfer of 35, there's been 22 transferred to reserves. Is that correct?
We took, as part of the budget process, the BAL process, we took money from the surplus to pay for some of the BAL items. At that time, we were projecting a surplus of 16.2.
Okay, but just to be clear, that if the surplus is 35 and we transferred 22 to reserves, the remaining 13 was used to pay off year-end issues from. Is that what you're telling me?
So we project a surplus. All surpluses at year end go into the reserve. What we were projecting back in March or February when we did the BAL list was a surplus of 16.2 that we were going to put in the reserve. So we will increase that amount that goes into the reserve.
Right, and is that but that's an increase over what the presentation showed, which was 22, wasn't it?
today's presentation. That's because it has the BAL money taken out. We've netted that out.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Whitman.
Thank you, Mayor Savage. I originally rang in because I wanted to speak on Councillor Adams' motion. I seconded it, and I just want to go on the record and say I'm not going to be able to support anything that has cuts to fire or search and rescue at this time. Thank you, Councillor Blackburn, for asking the questions about budget surpluses and reserves. I'm getting a lot of emails from residents right now that are asking me to ask those questions. So thank you for the answers, Jane. We'll get deeper into that the next time we meet, if that's tomorrow. I have questions from residents regarding Discover Halifax and the funding and the fee from hotel room levies. I have lots of concerns about transit technology and what I can say and can't say in public. So I'll just say there's concerns about transit. I also have concerns about getting transit fare box back up and running as soon as possible. I've heard, I think in this call, perhaps June the 1st, somehow getting transit back up. I think that we could have done a better job with masks and not gone to the free transit so fast. So the sooner the better. Same with parking revenue. It's time to get back up and running. I think that there are places that we can cut. I think our communications department during this time, I'm surprised there's been no cuts there. I'm not sure what's being communicated, but there's a lot of people there. The libraries are all closed, and I'm sure there's people that are doing lots of good work, but there's room there. And of course, there's room in the mayor's office too. So I'm concerned about all those departments, and we'll dig in deeper and peel this back and hopefully find something that we can all work with. Thank you.
Thank you. I would not agree that there's room in the mayor's office budget. You've had lots of opportunities to ask me questions. If you take out the HR component of the mayor's office budget, when I became mayor, it was $160,000. It's been reduced to $82,000, and through these cuts, it's reduced to $40,000, 1/4 of what it was 8 years ago.
Yes, it was very bloated before. I'm just concerned about staff that are doing scheduling, speech writing, social media work, research, all that right now. Thank you.
We have a lot of people across the city who are working from home and still doing. It's not as if people aren't, as you just indicated, people are still calling, looking for assistance.
Yeah, but there's no speeches or social media right now. Thank you.
Excuse me? There's no speeches for social media?
There's no speeches and photo ops right now, Mayor, in lockdown.
There are a lot. Well, I'm not going to get into an argument with you. If you want the facts, I can present the facts to you.
No, I've already got the facts.
Opinion, you're not entitled to your facts. Councillor Outfit.
Thank you.
I always get to follow the tough ones here. Wow, I tell you. So listen, thank you to everybody who has presented today and asked questions. And so Jane, I'm going to list off a few things here for you and Chuck, and then I'll try and keep it quick so I don't have to come back too much tomorrow. I'm still wrestling with the idea that we wouldn't be in a slightly better position on June 1st to make some decisions. And I understand the difference between cash flow and budget, but I also know cash flow impacts budget. So I a little more understanding why we couldn't be in a little bit better. You might be out by $10, you might be out by $10 million on your projections of what's going to come in. So I'm still kind of wrestling with that. Knowing you, Jane, is probably closer to the $10. That's all right. Wayne made some comments on capital that I'll be following up on tomorrow. Certainly Steve and Steve both came out with some comments on fire and volunteer fires that I supported. And Jane, you mentioned about how it would be kind of silly to have a tax increase right now when people are struggling to pay and lots of people have lost jobs and income and whatnot. And I certainly agree with that comment. One of the things that I'd like to get a little bit of an explanation on is transit, because right now transit is an essential service. We're running it. We're doing the best we can. We know that we're losing $3 million a month in revenue. But when I look at what's projected for transit, it's sort of, we're going to have to go back to where we were, but we're going to expect a lot less ridership and thus a lot less revenue. But are we also looking at, and I've always been fine with subsidizing the heck out of transit for the greater good, provided that it was used. But if it's not being used and it's no longer an essential service after the state of emergency, I'm just a little wondering, if you and Jacques and Dave are going to be able to tell us just really how far are we going to be willing to go on this? as far as increasing the budget, while so many other budgets are being reduced. Question on the strategic reserves. It shows a little over $30 million. Does that include the 20 million earmarked for the stadium? And does it include the 30 plus that we're going to be getting when the St. Pat's High property deal closes? So I'm a little worried. I'm a little wondering about the balance of the strategic reserve, Jane. Hotel levy tax, I'm a little confused with that one as well, Jane, showing that it's a loss of income, but we really don't use that money. We hand it out again in grants and special events. So I'm just kind of wondering why the department is showing that as a lesser income, less revenue. And I think I was going to ask for a little bit more clarification from Jacques on his take on how the Fed, and I don't expect a lot of provincial government help, but I'm hoping that we'll see some grants from the federal government. And I think I understand now a little bit better where FCM, I thought, was looking more for operational help, and the CIO was talking about perhaps we're looking more for stimulus spending and project, how those could work together. But so that's fine. And the last thing is Jacques, and I always just put Jacques in a tough position, but we are going to have to try and figure out a way for council to answer questions about layoffs and cutbacks and whatnot, because while we don't talk about HR issues in public, and I never have, we are making public that we are cutting compensation by 21 million. There are some term positions. I think it's a reasonable question for a taxpayer to ask their councillor, has somebody looked at additional cuts? Has somebody looked at even rolling back compensation slightly? So while I understand Jacques wants to give us that advice in camera, and I respect that, but I think it's something we are going to have to at some point be able to answer the public. So there's some questions for you, Jane, and for Jacques, and thank you for all you're doing.
Okay, thank you, Councillor, through you, Mr. Mayor. On the date, as I mentioned earlier, I think Jane has mentioned this too, is that it's no problem going to early June necessarily, but beyond that, we're at high risk, right? So our preference is to go to the May date, but council wants to delay by a week. It's not a huge problem. We'll have a little bit more information that could inspire a different decision, I suppose. On transit, how far are we willing to go in terms of cutbacks to services and things like that? I think that was your question. We continue to evaluate this pretty much daily as to where we are with transit. We've had a number of rollbacks. This month we'll take a look and see again as to what further service cuts we need to implement, if any. There are always labor relations issues associated with any service cuts and layoffs. So we'd have to work through all that.
I'm hoping it's necessary.
Yeah, no, I think it's in my presentation. I think I stated the obvious, which was transit will not come back to its previous ridership anytime soon. If the economy was turned on tomorrow, I can't imagine that ridership would return to its normal level for at least a couple of years, to be honest with you, because people will have taken other means. People may be nervous, in terms of recurrence. Now, all those factors will play into the decision of people to use transit going forward. And we'll have to, we're looking at, we're hoping to get some decisions, some positive decision of the UARB associated with shields and guards, etc., or on buses. We'll see how that turns out, but we'll make some decisions around that to hopefully protect our drivers more and our passengers. On the federal non-infrastructure funding, that may be a potential conversation, and with the province, which may be a potential conversation. We're taking this sort of one step at a time. Our focus has been on the federal level for infrastructure and transit. The provincial level, we've been focused on property tax deferrals and infrastructure, trying to find some relief for businesses, but also protecting our revenue, our tax revenue at the same time. There haven't been any decisions beyond at the provincial level beyond the short-term loan program, but I know they are considering other means, and I'm constantly optimistic that we'll certainly get some support on On infrastructure, I would assume, because everybody, including the Premier and the Prime Minister, are talking about trying to restart the economy and through use of infrastructure funding. So that's, I'm not as optimistic on sort of blanket operational monies coming through. I am more optimistic on perhaps more categories being eligible on the infrastructure side. In other words, they may relax some of the rules around what's eligible and what's not, given that we have a bunch of shovel-ready projects that don't necessarily always fit into the precise categories that they have. So anyway, we're working through all that. On the hotel levy, you know, it's a cash in, cash out kind of thing, to the extent that there will be no hotel levy monies collected by hotels this year to any large extent. So whatever they get, whatever is collected, they likely will get, but it's very challenging. It'll be, you know, it's a very dire situation in the hotel industry right now, and the restaurant industry. Hotels are empty, and the chances of people, you know, we know that our borders are closed, and this summer that we know there'll be very few people coming into staying at hotels other than the local market. And unless the New Brunswick border opens up, you won't get anybody from PEI and New Brunswick either, right? So you look at local tourism, interprovincial tourism, intraprovincial tourism, I should say, and that would have a minimal take up in hotel rooms. On the reserves, Jane, perhaps you could comment on what does it include, and you know, in terms of what monies went in and those kinds of things, and where does the football stadium fit into that? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So on the strategic reserve, we already have received the funding from St. Pat's High. That deal closed and it has been deposited in the strategic capital reserve. I will point out that the balance on the sheet that was handed out is as of January 31st, so that's why it's not reflected there. We have indicated or allocated the stadium to be withdrawn from the strategic capital reserve in fiscal 23-24. So in the commitment column there's $20 million.
And Mr. Mayor, I would just add to that you know, there's many in the decision that council made around the stadium, there's many points of debarkation, right? So, you know, that's certainly not laid out in stone, because they have to do certain things in order to get that money, and that's so far that file has not progressed. The other one that I neglected to mention was the HR piece. Again, I can't comment on HR issues outside of an in-camera conversation. But you know, it's something that we don't believe that we're in a position right now that we need to do any of that. But you know, who knows what the fall will look like and what next spring will look like. So
and that's fine. And thank you, Jacques. That's kind of what I was looking for rather than details. Jane, just quickly, St. Pat's money is in the strategic reserve yet or not? St. Pat's High.
Yes, it is. It was deposited.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
I have nothing at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Nicol.
Thank you. And I know it's the late hour. I don't know how long we are going. I know it went till 4:30, but I think I want to focus more now because we've sort of talked about everything that we could possibly talk about and where our individual concerns were. So what is the format going to be for tomorrow's meeting so we can drill down even more to, because I would like to see, you know, a discussion about the reserves outside of the strategic capital reserve or the parkland dedication one. And then I'd like to also get more information with regards to how strategic we are in the federal and provincial ask, you know, because a lot of people mentioned transit and, you know, our cash flow being, you know, that loss and how we're going to respond to that. And our case to borrow the 188 million, you know, like, and especially, I know I think it was Jacques that was said it was for our own good that we would be paying 33 million in interest. I think I think we need to get more information in that regard. And I know Councillor Walker and I agree that it would be nice to have a discussion by business unit. And we have to give a because even when it comes, like Brad needs to tell us exactly what we are being asked with regards to the green cart for the contractors by May 15th, which is just Friday. So I know, and then vacancy management, I've had some questions about that as well as it goes by business unit, but I would like to ask the mayor to consider putting that in camera for tomorrow. I know we don't have much time, so I'm basically just wanting to continue the conversation, but I think we need to be more focused.
Right. What was the one in camera, Laura Lee?
Well, the whole vacancy management, and I know, but I think the whole staffing thing, we need to have, you know, a discussion, and we don't want to necessarily have it in public.
So I think we're not at the end of high level, because I'm hearing from other councillors that they still want to have more conversation. We're in committee of the whole. We'll pick it up tomorrow. I think Jacques and the agenda review crew, we should have a conversation before tomorrow in terms of the best way forward. And I'm hearing from people that they want to go talk to the department heads. So, and I know that they're on the call and available for questions. We'll just have to figure out how we can do that in such a way that we don't go through the entire budget process, but look at the changes. So Jacques, maybe that's something you and I and the deputy and others from agenda review can have a conversation about in the morning.
Sure. Yeah.
In terms of getting people the information that they want, Councillor Nichol, okay, it's okay. Appreciate that. Was there any specific questions, Laura Lee, you had now?
No, because I know that I was just trying to create some formats or some themes, because when it comes to the reserve, like have a conversation about the reserves specifically, but I'll leave that to your agenda review, but I just, I know that we all each have our own concerns and questions, and we've heard a lot of them, so I just wanted to have it more, I guess, more themed tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, so the last speaker is Councillor Adams.
Thank you, Worship, and this will be brief. I just need to know the status of the amendment that I had put forward. Well, how will we address that tomorrow?
Well, hopefully tomorrow. When we've had I think what we have to do is figure out. I'm going to try to figure out how we get people more information specifically by department, and whether that means every director comes to speak or not is a big question. That's a long process, but you know, we have questions that people want to answer. But whenever we get to what we call a parking lot, yours will be the first one in it.
Okay, could I suggest that perhaps like Laura Lee had suggested, let's deal with TPW, and then let's deal with another department, no different than a regular budget meeting, because we used to have them. We used to have legal come in or whatever. There's no reason why we can't do it the same way. Just you know, similar format, but just a different way of doing it. So it's just a suggestion to be considered. Okay?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
That's what I'm hearing from councillors by text and everything else, that they want to do that. That wasn't the way that Jacques and Jane had wanted to do it, but they may also think now that it might be simpler to do that and find a way to hear from the direct department heads. So we'll try to figure that up so that we can we'll deal with it tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Sean, you haven't spoken yet, Councillor Cleary, so let me get you in.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a very quick question for Jane and her staff. For example, with fiscal services, the deed transfer tax, given that we had a major increase in deed transfer tax this year, 35 million, where we estimated 16 million, could we have just a bit more information about the assumptions and the calculation used to predict the $7.6 million reduction in deed transfer tax? What I've been hearing and reading in the media and from talking to some property owners and developers is lots of people are scoping out for deals at the moment. So, you know, crises breed opportunities, as someone said earlier. So I know a number of people will be looking for distressed properties and be purchasing those, which will maybe at a reduced price, but will still actually lead to deed transfer tax. So if we could just maybe get some more information emailed to us later about what those assumptions and calculations were to show that reduction, that's all I was asking for.
Certainly, Councillor. So we had, as part of the setup for the original 2021 budget year, we actually employed CAMAC Economics to do some modeling for us on deed transfer tax. So that's why we increased our deed transfer tax in the budget for the current year. What we've done is we've taken a 15% write down on what we think it is. You are right. There will be opportunistic buying, but it's just about when that closes. What we are seeing on some big developments is that Halifax was a very attractive model. What we do know, though, from economics is that really deed transfer tax is quite sensitive to economic modeling. So what we're seeing, we're still seeing deed transfer tax come in. But some of that is there's a time lag from when a property closes to when we get it. So we will be watching that and modeling it to see where it is and if it holds.
Thanks, Ms. Fraser. In the meantime, is it possible to share the CANMAC information with Council?
Certainly.
Thank you. I think you're muted, Mike.
Yeah. So just a sense of where we are for tomorrow. So we never expected we get through this today. We're going to reconvene. I'd like to talk to Jacques and Jane shortly after this meeting, if we could, and the deputy mayor, and perhaps others, just to talk about how we would proceed tomorrow. But my sense is that people want more department information from the departments as to how they came up with their budget cut proposals. So we have to figure out that piece, and then we need to figure out how we deal with items that might be added or subtracted from the cut list. Councillor Russell has suggested some things, and of course there will be others as well. So, but that's fine. It's been a longish day, starting at 9. I don't usually spend this much time on a screen unless it's the NFL, and I find that easier. So I appreciate everybody today. It is 1 o'clock tomorrow, Cheryl.
Yes, it is.
So we will reconvene at 1 o'clock tomorrow. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Move to adjourn.
Thank you.
Ciao.